What's up, everybody? Might postpone this to March. Wearing my aquamarine type stuff. March. Might have to postpone it a couple weeks. But hope I don't have to whisper. There's my telescope, about to break it down. Well, what I want to talk about today. I want to say, in my video about getting saved, I might title this video Sublimation. And I've already talked about that in another video. So I might have to put the date. But sublimation, it's when you can't have one thing, so you accept another. When option A is closed off to you, it's unavailable, you'll take option B or C if B is also not available. And it's kind of like, the analogy with Dr. Pepper, Coke, and Sprite. I love Dr. Pepper or Dr. anything, but if it's not available, I will choose from one of my second favorite flavors, such as root beer, Sprite, or lemon lime or ginger ale, or just plain old cola. They can't call it Coke. But sublimation, I've talked about it before, about my fetishes, about how a lot of these other things, such as vomit, and later on colds. I didn't use that word in the video about being saved, and it's like my vocabulary is big, but a lot of times I have a hard time accessing words that I know. Hence the My vocabulary is bigger than it seems. Sublimation. So if you were just really obsessed, you would give anything to have a certain kind of doll. And that's where a lot of these boy dolls, I was sublimating. Once I got saved, it's like I no longer had as much of a desire to live as male anymore. I understood how wrong it was, that I wasn't supposed to want that. But there was still the desire to see someone presenting in a masculine way. To see someone being flat-chested with short hair and nothing feminine about their clothing, despite having originally been intended as a female. And I want to talk about this being my makeshift Arthur from Sword in the Stone. Now, one of the things I wish I could have would be an Arthur doll. An Arthur about this tall, like that elf with a smaller head. See, he fulfills the need to have an 8-inch male doll, even though he's an ornament, not a doll. But I've always thought the world would be a better place if Disney characters in middle childhood, as I've stated before, were made into dolls like this, rather than only existing as such dolls in their adult form. Probably the only way you'd have such an Arthur doll is if they could misrepresent him as being further along into puberty than he originally was, like a Kevin-sized doll. That's why Kevin was so special to me around that time. You know, he could be like a 10-inch, you know, like a miniature Ken doll. You know, like Peter Pan has a Kevin body. So he could still, you know, because a lot of times the way these silly cartoon characters are drawn on all shows, including Disney, but especially non-Disney, they're drawn like freaks of nature. And that's why I love adding that realism of dissection. But they're made to look like freaks whose bodies wouldn't actually perform very well in real life. You know, skinny little legs, bird legs, you know, to indicate that they're not a muscle man. Big, broad shoulders in proportion of that, kind of like Cedric. You know, his body proportion was very similar to Arthur in Sword in the Stone. And so they're given body proportion, you know, tiny little waist, tiny little necks that wouldn't support a big head like they got. Body proportions that wouldn't make sense and would be more like a disease. You know, like voice changes way ahead of growth spurts, which would make them end up very short in real life. So they're misrepresented on purpose. And as such, you know, you really can't make merchandise to look like them unless it lies. Unless it gets a few things wrong, so to speak. You know, like thicker necks on the Rugrats. You know, just things that are slightly not proportioned the way the cartoon is. In order for Cedric to be made into a good doll, he'd have to sort of put on a little bit of weight, especially in the legs. So, when they make a 1/6 doll, the only way you really get that with a male character tends to be if he can be portrayed as looking at least 13. You know, like a Kevin doll. Like maybe a 10-inch Ken doll, a short Ken doll with a boyish face. Is about the closest you would ever get to that. You know, he'd be like a Kevin with arms that bend, kind of like a High School Musical boy. Only he'd have the head sculpt to look like Arthur. Is what that would be like, and he'd probably cost hundreds of dollars. Same thing with Mowgli in the Jungle Book. You know, he'd have to look more, you know, like he's at least getting into puberty. Like he's suddenly entered his teens. Because they just really have a problem with, you know, representing boy dolls as being too much like the girls, and I know exactly what it is. Because, I mean, what's to stop a kid from putting this blue dress on this doll and just having a short-haired girl? So, although that looks nothing like him, I just named him Arthur. And so while he could just, you know, he's basically just a blonde doll named Arthur that still looks like a girl with a haircut, I see him as being the closest you can get to a modern take on Arthur. And one of these red-haired girls I've decided is Jenny from Oliver and Company, though I never saw that movie. So Penny and Jenny and Cody and Arthur look almost the same. Then this is the only actual kidcore boy with flocked hair, and it would be coming off if I remove the hat. So I think he was intended to wear this outfit. You know, it was supposed to be for Kyle. But, you know, I mean, even if he's just a plain old blonde boy that happens to be named Arthur, you know, it kind of scratches that itch in my mind. But, you know, just want to talk about that, and might have an unboxing soon, make a part 2. But yeah, sublimation. When you can't have A, you settle for B. You know, I don't have access to an actual sword in the stone Arthur, like I've wanted for so long. So instead, I just make a random blonde-haired boy out of a girl of sorts. Name him Arthur, and if he's wearing red and he has blonde hair, then he can just happen to be named Arthur and wear the same colors. Same thing with Jenny from Oliver and Company. Don't think there was ever a Jenny like that. But yeah, I just don't know why. It's like, I mean, I feel like that's just a missing, yeah, it's like a missing part of the doll world. You know, you have like little tiny ones like this. Little, you know, Kelly size that are just proportioned way too small. You know, they're like a toddler that's extremely undersized. And I think I may have even written a letter to Mattel years ago saying that Kelly and Tommy, although they were cute, were just undersized. You know, a normal 3-year-old is about 3 feet tall, which would be about 6 inches. And so that's more like the Chelsea doll. But Kelly and Tommy were more like the size of a 9-month-old with the hair of a 2-year-old. And for many years, that's how they were. They were either little bitty undersized toddlers who were actually on the 1/8 scale, more or less. 1/7, 1/8, something like that. Like, in order for their parents to look right, they should have been more Skipper-sized. They were more like the Sunshine Family kids. And the Sunshine Family dads, you know, if they wouldn't have melted so badly, you know, they made perfect substitute sublimations for this need for young boy dolls. I used to pretend like Dad from the Sunshine Family was like a young teenager or 12-year-old in the Barbie world because he was about 9 inches. But of course they melted. And of course, you know, Mom could also be a little girl. So you either had severely undersized toddlers, about yay high, about this tall, or you had full-on adults. And if at all possible, a Disney character would only ever be made into a Barbie scale doll if at least by the end of the movie they were an adult. Like, they pretty much had to be at least 16 to be made into such a doll. And they, of course, they had modesty panties and briefs, which I'm totally cool with that. But they had to at least, you know, be like old enough to drive a car, you know, old enough to be finishing high school and getting a class ring and senior portraits and all that. They had to be like that. Or, you know, then you had your Kelly and Tommy, which really and truly were not compatible with Barbie. And before that, you did have Stacy and Todd. But unfortunately, you know, they phased them out. And it became almost exclusively girls after 95. Rarely you'd see a movie collectible, like a character from a movie that was a boy, roughly that size, like Anakin, and Harry Potter. And of course the Jonathan Taylor Thomas Pinocchio that I keep mentioning. But it's like they had some extreme aversion to making such a doll. And it was, it was just, yeah, it's like they didn't want any 1/6 scale characters or Disney characters. If a Disney character existed, it was only ever seen as a child 6 through 12. They're probably not made into a doll. Cody and Penny, Arthur and Jenny, John on Peter Pan. Any character that fit that description. Alice in Wonderland was sort of misrepresented as a young teenager, a skipper type girl, for that very reason. It's like if they were close to being a teenager, they'd bump them up. Give them an age bump. Like, Alice in Wonderland being portrayed as more like 13 to 15 instead of 12. They'd almost have to do the same thing with Arthur, given the Peter Pan treatment of just making him look, like his body is just a young, short man's body with a little boy's head. Like a Kevin doll. And dress him like Arthur. That's the only way they could make one. So yeah, it's like they have to bump him up. Or, I guess they could have tried to sell a Michael doll as a Tommy doll, but they never did. They could bump them down, or they could make them a different type. Like the little young Rhea dolls, where they're more toddler-like on a bigger scale. They just never wanted, younger kids to exist in the Barbie world. Even with modesty underwear and things, to prevent anything nasty from being enacted. It was almost like a very disturbing reason why they may have done that, or, why there's like an unspoken conspiracy not to buy such things if they would have been made, if they would have made like a Cody from the Rescuers, or even a Penny from the Rescuers, which would have been much older. It would almost be like there was an unspoken conspiracy, that while you may sell a couple of pennies, Cody would pretty much remain on the shelf. And, so, I don't know. So, sublimation. I had to sublimate these Katie dolls, which were marketed as a little sister of a cheaper Barbie knockoff named Kelsey. Since I wasn't out of as much money as if it were Stacy. So I just have to sublimate them and ignore the fact that the facial features are different. They're not exactly the same. I mean, who really cares? It's just a craving for the name more than anything. It's not anything, to do with the actual character, which in many cases I never even watched the movie. Don't know much about the movie, don't remember much about it, and don't care. It's just me seeing something saying, oh, I wish I had an Arthur. Oh, I wish I had a Jenny. And a Cody and a Penny. But yeah, it's almost like I saw Katie as more of a 7-inch craft doll with a prettier face. And that she could be anything I wanted her to be. And so yeah, you just, sublimation. It's a word for, you'll accept option B if you can't have A. And if you can't have either one, you'll accept C and maybe D, and so on. And that's exactly what happened, with the obsession with colds. That's how I got into it. I've talked about that a year ago. wherein I wanted to write stories. Basically, I have fantasies about seeing antagonist humiliated, especially in front of protagonist, by being made to appear weak. And my favorite scenario is antagonist sees himself as a superhero, who doesn't get sick and is certainly not a baby in need of a diaper. And it's very similar to the ABDL thing. And the protagonist, could just be someone who is just innocent and pure and, just nothing bad you could say about the protagonist, really. And seeing them humiliated in front of the protagonist. And I believe that although they didn't spell it out, it's exactly why Cedric was created in Sophia the First. The unspoken dialogue that they tried to hide is humiliation of a man in front of a little girl that he tried to steal from. And the fact that Rugrats fans and Sophia fans do not catch these things just means they're dumb. It doesn't mean I'm wrong, it means they're dumb. They're still just a little child in the head. So, sublimation. Was not allowed to write about poop. So, sometimes, and you can't really show poop very well. I mean, let's be honest. So, you can sublimate it to like a puke scene. You'll settle for puke. But then, that doesn't really make sense because most people don't just barf everywhere. When they're sick, they get over a toilet or they get to a bathroom. And most people would be understanding enough not to laugh at someone for that. So that's when, around 7th grade, as I stated before, it sort of morphed into this obsession with colds. Was a decade past the poop thing. Kids were no longer barfing that much in class anymore, though it still happened at home. So colds were like just a third, much more watered down option, to fulfill this need to, I don't know how to explain it, to create scenarios in my head wherein this person that's an antagonist is humiliated by their own weakness in front of a protagonist who is often just, sweet little innocent child with no concept of that, no reason to be ashamed of their body and what it produces, and very much like Rugrats. And that's why, saying Tommy did it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. No sense whatsoever. Because it would not fulfill any, what purpose would that serve to the narrative? Yes, Tommy could have used his diaper, but that's beside the point. What purpose would it serve to the narrative to have a baby for whom it is acceptable to do that? To have that be the punchline, it just isn't. That's the only thing that makes sense. It just isn't. It would make just a little bit of sense for it to be Nigel and have a dad joke. But the other kids would not just bust out laughing because Tommy used his diaper, for its intended purpose. They just wouldn't. And the other thing, it doesn't make sense for Tommy to have held it. See, that's more important. It wouldn't make sense for Tommy to have spent the whole day in a clean, dry diaper at age 1, and then to have suddenly used his diaper at that moment. That doesn't make any sense. So the Tommy did it doesn't check out, because it doesn't fulfill the need to humiliate the antagonist, and it doesn't make sense, in the first place, because a 1-year-old can't hold it that long. You know what I'm saying? Tommy, would have already needed a diaper change, in Act 1. All of them would. But the punchline is that Angelica did. The comeuppance was her being humiliated and brought down to the level of a baby. You see. So, yeah, I have no doubts. But the truth doesn't really matter to such people. It really doesn't. Whatever makes them feel comfortable is what they want. And they're idiots. And But yeah, I mean, even like I've stated before a million times, even if you could remove that, take that out, clip it out, like Dan Schneider says, just cut it out. It's like nothing ever happened. It still does not leave you with something I'd be proud to watch or show a kid. Because, I mean, the mere fact, you know, they didn't call attention to this, but I mean, the mere fact that the dads were wearing effing hula skirts, even if they had pants underneath, is wrong. You know, it's culture appropriation at best, and it's effeminacy, you know, and an abomination at worst. So, you know, it's two of those things. Violates Deuteronomy 22:5 and also culture appropriation. You know, because the kind of person that wears such a hula skirt is a Hawaiian, or, you know, a young Hawaiian maiden, basically, with nothing, or I guess, I don't know what they'd wear underneath, but it wouldn't be men's pants. So, you know, it's culture appropriation. It's an abomination for men to put on skirts and dresses like that. So, you know, the mere fact that Drew and Howard and, well, I think everyone but Stu, I think it was supposed to be symbolic, you know, make Stu look like the real man of the group without coming out and saying it. Because they use a lot of symbolism that idiots do not catch on to. And so even if, you know, you took out that tiny little clip that I've been harping on for 6 years, at least, maybe 7. Even if you took that out, it's still an offensive movie. Because it has men in skirts. It has, you know, boys without a shirt, because I don't care, you know, what society thinks. I don't like to see male nipples either. I don't like to see anyone, even if they don't have nipples. I don't like to see people without a shirt, even if they just happen to, for whatever reason, not have nipples, like a birth defect. I still don't like to see people. I like to see people with shirts, regardless of gender. I don't like to see people dressing in ways that would get me in serious trouble if I copied them, if you know what I mean. So I'll go ahead and post this 30-minute rant.